All right. So we've been going through all these, and we're going to continue to do this, go through them. The first one, obviously, the BNSF, and we've gone through the Santa Fe, the Burlington, the Great Northern. Now we're going to do the Northern Pacific. And if just a review, the Santa Fe was the biggest of the BNSF, and then the Burlington was, and with the C&S, they always advertise themselves as 11,000 miles, which is what they had. And then the Great Northern, and then the Northern Pacific was a bit smaller. And we'll see why that the Great Northern grew more than the NP. The NP was earlier, but it also had a lot of financial problems, and did not have Jim Hill. That was one of the big problems. But the Great Northern was always more advanced and kind of a little bit more razzle dazzle. The NP was very conservative. And I believe it's because they went bankrupt 3 times, and that kind of shell shocks the organization, and you get a very conservative culture. The GN never went bankrupt, even during the Depression, because of Jim Hill. So if we looked like this is 1950, and again, we looked at that because it's the middle of the century. It's about halfway through the steam diesel transition. So the Great Northern had 568 steam engines in 1950 and 424 diesels. Now, if you factor in the fact that steam engines have a lot lower availability because they have to go to the shop after they've run, the diesels get to the end of the line and they just fill up the oil and the water and check them out, and then they head back. And so I think in terms of, even though they were in multiple units, I think between diesel and steam, I think it was probably about half and half in terms of ton miles hauled. But we see that so the Great Northern was almost half diesels, but the NP still had 661 steam engines and only 207 diesels. And that's because it's a more conservative railroad, and because they had gone bankrupt. And so it was always very conservative. So we'll go through some of the historical highlights. And this is a map of the Northern Pacific that they advertised in the 1950. And so here's the Chicago. Here's Chicago to St. Paul. That was on the Burlington, which the NP owned almost half the stock, and the Great Northern owned almost the other half. So the two railroads controlled the Burlington. And then, of course, the NP had the line to Duluth we'll talk about, and then a line from Staples across to Superior and Ashland. And then they had kind of a convoluted line up to Winnipeg, and then they headed across North Dakota, Montana to Spokane, and then to Portland, and then up to Seattle. And so because it was much earlier than the other railroads, they really got most of the big population centers in North Dakota, Montana, and Eastern Washington. Here's a bit more detailed map. But if you remember, the Great Northern, Jim Hill had built all these branch lines up north as he went west.
He service all the farmers.
Yeah, exactly. And so he was profitable. The Great Northern was profitable all the way across. It was better land, and they had all these branch lines. So they'd get to Williston, they built a branch line, and so they had traffic going. The NP did not do that. And they had a few branch lines here, as you see, in eastern North Dakota, and a few in southeast Washington, and a little bit in Idaho, but not much else.
Look at the map in Canada. In Canada, notice that between Manitoba and Alberta, it's called Assiniboia.
Oh, look at that.
That later became.
I did not notice that.
Became Saskatchewan, but the border between Saskatchewan and Alberta was moved way east. Alberta goes farther east than that. I'm not quite sure where it is, but Saskatchewan is nowhere near that big.
Oh, interesting. I'm glad you saw. I didn't catch that. No. Yeah, this is an early map.
Sure. I think Saskatchewan was 1905, somewhere around there. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Interesting. So looking back at the history of the NP, we have to start with Abraham Lincoln. And it was quite interesting to see how first he graduated from law school, and then he started doing law. And then he got involved with railroads early on. His first case, one of his first big cases, was he represented the Alton and Sangamon Railroad, which is in southern Illinois. And there was a landowner who refused to pay his stock pledge. You pledge to buy stock, you got to buy the stock. And so Lincoln, everybody expected Lincoln would not be able to win the case, but he won the case. And so he became quite a prominent lawyer. for the railroads. The other thing that was quite important is that Lincoln strongly supported America's expansion to the West. He was, now of course, this is the 1850s. He was very concerned about Britain or Spain or France or somebody coming in and taking the land. And so he said the United States has got to go west. And so the big problem that he ran into is that the railroads were east-west, from the east to the west. Whereas the current industry in the 1850s was up the Mississippi and up the Missouri and up the Ohio River with all the steamboats. That was a huge industry, and that's the way freight traffic and passenger traffic moved. And so there was a big conflict between the railroads going east-west and the river navigation being north-south. So he got involved when the Rock Island built the first railroad bridge to span the Mississippi River, and it went between Davenport, Iowa, and Rock Island, Illinois. And it's still being used. It's now the Iowa Interstate, but it was the main line of the Rock Island, Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. And so then in 1856, a steamboat collided with the Rock Island accidentally. Oh, supposedly.
Yeah.
Supposedly it was accidentally ran into the bridge. And so then the captain, this John Hurd, sued for damages, and he claimed the bridge was a hazard to navigation, and so they were basically trying to stop the railroads. Yeah. And so Lincoln led the case. He was the lead counsel, and he did a very good job because they expected the steamboats to win, but the jury was deadlocked 9-3 in favor of the railroads. But John Hurd did not collect any money. And Lincoln set the stage, and there were later cases the railroad got the right to build bridges across the big rivers, which was a big change. So they started to build into Iowa and Missouri. Now meanwhile in the 1850s, the Pacific Railroad Act was a formal act of Congress talking about building these railroads west. Now the big three routes they were talking about was the Northern Pacific. That went from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, and so that was the route they talked about. And of course, the Union Pacific was from Omaha, Council Bluffs, to Salt Lake City, and then the Central Pacific to Sacramento, and so that's the central route, the northern route, and then there was a southern route from Houston all the way to Los Angeles. And of course, it was bogged down because the Southern senators and representatives said they wanted to build the southern route, and they wanted to make all these states be slave states.
Slave states, right?
And so then, of course, nothing happened. The thing was bogged down. Well, then in 1861, the South seceded, and so then in 1862 they passed the Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862, and it was signed by Lincoln. And so the first bill was it chartered the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. And so they chartered from Omaha to Salt Lake City on the Union Pacific, and the Central Pacific was the western side. And the Union Pacific received $29 million in bonds and 11 million acres of land in a checkerboard. That's how they were giving land grants.
Right.
And the Central Pacific got 24 million in bonds and 8 million in acres. Now, the reason that's important for the Northern Pacific is because we had our friend Durant and General Dodge. Durant created this Credit Mobilier vehicle company, sort of a entity with the Union Pacific, and then the Union Pacific had to hire Credit Mobilier to build the railroad. And so it was about half corrupt. I say half corrupt because I believe they did actually build the railroad. It had to be rebuilt, but they did get the Union Pacific built. As opposed to most of the railroads at that time, they would get a charter, they would sell stock, and if any rail got laid, it was lucky. I mean, if we talked about how Jim Hill got started, the Minneapolis and St. Cloud Railroad, they got a charter from the legislature, and they sold a whole bunch of stock, and they laid a grand total of 2 miles of track. So, so all these people that bought stock. So Jim Hill found that, and then of course he used that to form the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, which became the Great Northern. So anyway, when the NP, the Northern Pacific bill came up, they said, "No, you guys are not going to get any money. You're just going to get land." So they gave them 44 million acres of land in a checkerboard. It was the largest land grant in history. Here it is in eastern Montana. They got and I was shocked. I knew it was big, but 20 miles on either side of the main line in Minnesota, and 40 miles either side of the line all the way to the Pacific coast. 44 million acres. And I think the BNSF still owns quite a bit of it.
Whoa.
So they go heading off, and so the idea was, if they have all this land, they could go to Europe and they could raise money because they would be able to sell the land. And so here's Montana. I mean, look at it. It's about half the state. I mean, it's just, even though it's a checkerboard, so it'd be about a quarter of the state. It's just, 40 miles either side. Here's the northern border,
Wow.
here's the southern border, and they get this big swath through Montana.